Hey there, everybody, and welcome to the Sound Arguments Podcast. Thanks for being here. No matter how you might have found the show, I'm glad that you're here, and I hope that you are ready to engage your brain. If you listened to episode 000, the show before the shows, then you have an idea of where we're headed for these first few weeks of what I hope is a very long run of this show. And today we are talking about ideology. I think it's important to start here because I see it as a jumping off point for the rest of the life of this show. So let's get started. I don't think that I have to elaborate when I say that politically we are living in interesting and in many ways unprecedented times. I hesitate to say unique because that would imply that there's nothing happening now that's ever been seen before. That's what unique means, and I don't think that that's entirely the case, but we'll save that one for some shows in the future. We'll expound on that later. One thing that I do think is unique to what we're experiencing right now is something that I've been calling the politics of things. A couple of years ago, a similar phrase began moving into the mainstream lexicon, and that was the Internet of Things. And that's used to describe all of the pieces in our lives that are now connected to the internet and connected to each other. Things like thermostats, refrigerators, house light fixtures, cars, garage doors, and the obvious ones too, like TVs and phones. It wasn't that long ago that the idea of a phone that you could use to surf the internet was a far off dream living in Steve Jobs' head. But here we are, and everything in our world is connected to the internet, pretty much. It's very, very hard to live an analog life in today's world. So similarly, there's the reason that I have tried to start using the phrase the internet or the politics of things is because I feel like there's been a web of politicization that has swept through nearly everything in our world. Everything has a political valence of some sort. Nothing is neutral. So all the more reason to discuss these things, right? So what is ideology? To me, ideology is important to define because it's a lens through which each of us as individuals see the world, and largely it comes from what we are taught, what we learn. The philosopher John Locke said 9 parts of 10 of what makes us who we are comes from what we're taught, and I think that that's true. It's individual experience. It's our beliefs about ourselves, about the world, and what we hope to see the world become eventually. We all have an ideology, and it's pretty much unique to us, and whether we realize it or not, it governs really just about everything that we do. So because of that, it's crucial, in my opinion, to take a sort of self-inventory, a self-examination, to make ourselves aware of what our ideologies are, what governs our thoughts and our decisions, and when we form an opinion about something, what are the foundations of that opinion? Are we willing to change our opinion, change that little puzzle piece of what makes up our ideology? How hard is it going to be for someone to change our minds about this subject or that subject? So I think it's important to have a good base of understanding, a good sense of self-awareness on this subject of ideology, because truthfully, it's going to anchor the point from which we have discussions, from which we argue our side. It's the anchor that holds us to what we believe. So you can see why this is so important. Now, whether you are a religious person or not, the fact of history is if you start going back in time, 30 years, 50 years, 75 to 100 years certainly, most individuals, their ideology was founded in their religion. From a purely utilitarian perspective, that's kind of what religion has been. It's been an ideology, a prepackaged, plug-and-play way of thinking for people. And I think that's why it's been such a comfort over the years, over history. It's a comfort to some people because that's what their religion is to them. It's a blueprint for how to think and what opinions to have and so on and so on. But today, at least in our American, if not the Western world at large, religion isn't a good enough standard for an ideology anymore, in some people's opinion. To some people, humanity has moved on beyond religious worldview and ideology and theology, and quite honestly, you don't have to agree with that for it to be true. It's observable. As a culture, there are less people, especially young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, the millennials, those pesky millennials. There's less of those people who affiliate with a religion than there's ever been before. And that's going to be the generation that supplants the elderly generation, and therefore our whole new culture is going to be a less religious culture overall if current trends continue. As a result of this, we're seeing politics step in and take over as the dominant source of ideology in our culture. It is the new religion. It's the new set of rules on how to think and what opinions to have. And I think this is where we confront some problems, because everyone wants their ideology to be the best ideology. Everybody wants to be able to confidently say, what I believe makes me a better person. Even sometimes so far as to say, my ideology makes me a better person than you. And the difficult thing about that is that, as we have established already, ideologies are complex. I mean, they're created out of a sum of our experiences and our learnings, and they're unique to us as individuals. That's just way too difficult. We can't be expected to come to an understanding of someone else's entire sum of learnings and experiences in order to take the perspective of the other. And so what we do is we simplify. We categorize and we group people together based on what we perceive their ideology to be. This plays out in two ways. First, we argue or we have discussions from the standpoint of the little guy. It's me and my personal ideology against you and your big group of people who think exactly the same way you do and share your same exact ideology. We see this all the time, right? So there's always that one conservative guy in a thread of replies to Rachel Maddow's tweets on Twitter, and he's arguing from the standpoint of the lone individual fighting against this sea of liberals who follow Rachel Maddow, and everybody's ganging up on him and all these things. And to him, that makes him sort of valiant or courageous or whatever. That doesn't have to be that exact example for you to understand what I'm saying. It's something we see a lot. The other way that we see this come into play is we argue or we discuss with the assumption that we are the overwhelming majority. All right, our opinion is shared by an overwhelmingly large number of people. And anyone who disagrees with us is the one standing alone against the army of people who have it correct. People who are just like us. So these two situations, the way that they play out, they're very similar and they're kind of opposite. But we see these things all the time. We lump ourselves and we lump other people we're having discussions with into smaller and smaller groups of more and more people, because it's easier to argue against the stereotype or the caricature of what we believe the opposing ideology to be. It's easier to do that than it is to treat someone as a more complex series of opinions and beliefs making up a unique ideology. Basically, it's easier to treat someone as part of a group than as an individual. As humans, we're constantly fighting this dialectical tension between wanting to be an individual and to be treated like one, and having a sense of belonging, to be a member of a group that makes us feel understood and welcomed and supported. And when we find a group that seems to share our ideology and share our opinions about the world, we gain an enormous sense of power. This is how movements are started, movements that change the world, political movements, uprisings, whatever you want to say. There's a group of people that have come together over a shared ideology, or at least a perceived shared ideology, and they start to act like it. However, when we join a group like that, we also lose something. There's definitely a trade-off to being a member of a group versus being an individual. We lose our ability to be a free-thinking and free-acting individual person. As a member of an ideological group, we are susceptible to in-group biases that can dictate our actions and our beliefs. When we join a group, we lose some of our freedom. It's important to understand this and consider how it might be affecting our lives. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who we're going to talk about more in detail in a couple of weeks, he called this getting lost in the finite. And he really saw it as a loss of individuality. He thought it kept you from being able to be a self. It made you incapable of being an individual because you think that you're making all these decisions that are guided solely by you as a person, but really you're operating within a system of beliefs that has a very prescribed way of thinking. And so you're making these decisions, but you're being influenced by the group. And so therefore you really aren't acting as an individual, you're acting as an actor within a certain ideological subset. Hopefully this has given you some food for thought this week. I definitely would encourage you to do that self-evaluation, that self-assessment of what is my ideology, what do I believe, and why do I believe it? Because it's going to be really important for you to consume this podcast moving forward from a basis of that understanding. And I really do think it's something that is crucial to the way that we have conversations, that we have these arguments, these things, discussions about things that really are relevant and really matter. So, as I said, hopefully this has given you some food for thought. If you'd like to get in on the discussion right now with your own opinions, you can do that and engage with the show by finding us on Twitter at soundarguepod. That's searching on Twitter for us at soundarguepod. Yes, it's a terrible name, but hopefully if this podcast gets some attention, gets some traction, I can find the person who owns the Sound Arguments handle and talk them into giving me that and get verified. Maybe it'll happen. Hopefully. We'll see. If you are into some other platforms on social media, the show is also on Gab. You can find us on Gab by searching at Sound Arguments. And as always, feel free to send us an email with thoughts, ideas, discussion topics, whatever you want. You can email us at soundargumentspodcast@gmail.com. So we will wrap it up with the big ideas for this week. And those are this. We all have an ideology. It's important to understand what our own ideology is and how it's been formed, how it's being formed every day. When we engage with people in meaningful discussion, we have to treat them as individuals with their own unique set of opinions shaped by their own experiences, their own learnings, forming their own unique ideology. We can't treat them like some cheap cardboard cutout of what we think their ideology means and what we think that they believe. Lastly, take an honest look at which ideological groups you consider yourself to be a part of, and ask yourself if you're sacrificing any of your individuality at the expense of belonging to a group. That is it for this week. This has been the Sound Arguments Podcast. Thanks for listening, and as always, be sure to subscribe on iTunes and on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe button. That really helps out a lot. Maybe leave a comment below, and we will talk to you next time.